A quiet public park, full of tourists photographing flower beds and walking past a colonial-era church, is hiding a roofless stone tower that has spent nearly 2 centuries daring historians to prove it wrong. The windmill story is not the whole truth. The whole truth is a scientific fight that has run for 200 years and still hasn't been settled. The city that owns the tower has spent decades and tens of thousands of dollars funding studies to protect it, not to end the argument, but to keep it alive, because a mystery brings in more visitors than a settled answer ever could. Across the street, a man named Jim Egan runs his own private museum, still trying to convince professional archaeologists that everyone else has the story wrong. None of them have taken the bait. This is the Newport Tower in Toro Park, Newport, Rhode Island, and depending on who you ask, it was raised in the 1670s by a colonial governor, or as much as 400 years earlier than that. It has stood at the corner of Mill Street and Bellevue Avenue through 350 years of colonial settlement, revolution, tourism, and argument. No roof, no door at ground level, just 8 stone columns holding up 8 round arches, and above them a cylindrical wall of fieldstone, 28 feet high, wrapped in mortar that has outlasted the people who mixed it. The walls run 3 feet thick, wrapped around an empty chamber about 18 feet across, lit by 7 small windows and a fireplace cut into the stone. Traces of old white plaster still cling to a few of the interior columns. Walk around it, and you'll notice something odd immediately. It doesn't look like anything else in Newport. Newport is a city of white clapboard houses and black shutters, built by English colonists who liked their architecture plain. This tower looks like it wandered out of a European abbey and got lost in New England. That contrast is exactly why people can't leave it alone. The city of Newport now owns the land the tower sits on, protected inside a National Historic Landmark District. It is, by most accounts, the oldest standing structure in the state of Rhode Island. The park itself only exists because a philanthropist named Judah Turo left the city $10,000 in 1854 specifically to buy this land and keep it open to the public forever. For a country as young as the United States, that alone makes it valuable. But the tower's real fame doesn't come from its age. It comes from the question nobody has ever fully closed: who built it and when? The official answer, the one most historians will give you without hesitation, is almost disappointing in how ordinary it sounds. A windmill, built by an English colonial governor named Benedict Arnold sometime in the 1660s or 1670s, to grind corn for a growing settlement on Aquidneck Island. Not a Viking outpost, not a Templar refuge, a mill. The kind of unglamorous, practical structure colonial towns needed to survive. And there's real paper behind that story. Arnold's will, dated the 24th of December, 1677, describes property that includes what he calls, in his own handwriting, my stone-built windmill. A cemetery deed from earlier that same year calls it Ye Stone Mill. His family's burying ground sits between the tower and the site of his old mansion, close enough that whoever wrote those documents was clearly describing the same patch of land the tower still occupies today. Later records keep calling it a mill, too. An Old Town description from 1741 refers to it as the Old Stone Mill. A 1776 British military map, drawn by a surveyor named Des Barres during the Revolution, labels it, in plain lettering, Stone Windmill. American soldiers used the upper level as a lookout post. British soldiers, when they held the town, used it to store gunpowder. Through all of that, in every single document, it's a mill. Nobody writing about it in the 1600s or 1700s seemed to think there was anything mysterious about it at all. So here's the first crack. If the mystery is real, why does the earliest paperwork treat the tower like it's the least interesting building in Newport? Because it should have been noticed long before Arnold. Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed along this coast in 1524, more than 100 years before English settlers arrived in the 1630s. English colonists founded Newport itself in 1639. If a strange stone tower, round, arched, clearly built with skilled masonry, had already been sitting on that hill when they got there, somebody would have written it down. Explorers wrote down everything. Strange ruins were exactly the kind of thing colonial diarists loved to describe in long, breathless letters home. And yet there's nothing. No account from the 1500s, no account from the early 1600s. The silence runs for more than 130 years, and then, right around the time Benedict Arnold owned that land, the tower appears in the record for the first time, described, matter-of-factly, as his mill. That silence is one of the strongest arguments mainstream historians have. But it's also, strangely, one of the things that keeps the mystery alive. Because to a skeptic, absence of evidence isn't the same as proof. And once you actually stand in front of the tower and look up at those arches, you start to understand why, for almost 2 centuries now, a very different explanation has refused to die. Look at the stonework closely. The columns aren't just stacked rock. The arches are rounded, evenly spaced, built with the kind of architectural confidence you'd expect from European church builders, not corn millers. In 1953, the director of the Danish National Museum, a scholar named Johannes Bronsted, looked at photographs of the tower and admitted something that fringe researchers still quote today. He said the Romanesque lines of the tower were so convincing that if it stood in Europe, almost nobody would argue with dating it to the Middle Ages. Coming from a man who did not believe the tower was Norse, that's a remarkable thing to say out loud. That resemblance is where the real trouble started. In 1837, a Danish antiquarian named Carl Christian Raffin published a massive compilation of Old Norse sagas called Antiquitates Americanae, introducing English-speaking readers to the story of Leif Erikson in a place the Vikings called Vinland, a land somewhere across the Atlantic that Norse sailors had reached around the year 1000, 500 years before Columbus. Raffin wanted physical proof that Vinland was real, and he went looking for it in New England. He wrote to the Rhode Island Historical Society, and in May of 1839, the Society's secretary, Thomas Webb, sent him a drawing of a strange, round tower standing on a hill in Newport. Raffin didn't hesitate. He decided the tower was a Norse round church, built around the year 1121 by a Viking bishop named Eric Gnupsson, sent to find and minister to Norse colonists somewhere in the New World. He pointed to real medieval round churches in Scandinavia, Orfyr on Orkney, built around 1115, and Osterlars on the Danish island of Bornholm, built around 1160, as architectural cousins to the tower in Newport. To European eyes, steeped in Romanesque architecture, the comparison wasn't crazy. It was seductive. And it landed at exactly the right cultural moment. 19th century Americans of English and Scandinavian descent were hungry for a story that gave them a heroic European past on this continent that predated Columbus and the Spanish Empire entirely. A Viking tower did that perfectly. It gave New England its own creation myth, one that didn't need the Catholic monarchs of Spain in it at all. The story got a massive cultural push 4 years later, in 1941, when the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who had taught himself Old Norse specifically to read sagas like the ones Raffin had translated, published a poem called The Skeleton in Armor. In it, a Viking ghost describes building the lofty tower, which, to this very hour, stands looking seaward. Longfellow tied the poem to a real, strange discovery, a skeleton found in 1832 near Fall River, Massachusetts, buried with brass ornaments that some observers thought looked vaguely Norse. That skeleton was destroyed in a fire in 1843, so nobody can test it today, but the poem outlived it. By the early 20th century, postcards of the Newport Tower were being sold across the country, labeled, without any hesitation at all, Ancient Viking Tower. A colonial mill had become, in the popular imagination, hard historical proof that Europeans reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. But here's where it gets more complicated, because the Norse theory wasn't the only one competing for the tower's real story, and some of the others are stranger than you'd expect. In the early 20th century, a Brown University psychologist named Edmund Delabarre became fascinated with a nearby carved boulder called Dighton Rock, arguing its markings were Portuguese, not Native American or Norse, left by the doomed explorer Miguel Corte Real, who vanished along this coast in 1502 while searching for his brother. A physician named Manuel Luciano da Silva extended that theory to the tower itself, arguing Corte Real's crew, or a later Portuguese expedition, built it as a watchtower or chapel. A former American ambassador, Herbert Pell, even compared its architecture in 1948 to the Convent of Christ at Tomar in Portugal. It has never gained traction with mainstream historians, and modern scholars believe the Corte Real legend itself was inflated for decades by Portuguese national propaganda. Then there's the theory that refuses to go away, the Knights Templar. In 1992, British writer Andrew Sinclair published a book claiming medieval Scottish Templars, under a nobleman named Henry Sinclair, sailed to North America roughly 100 years before Columbus and built the tower as a religious outpost. The alleged Sinclair voyage itself is disputed by mainstream historians. That hasn't stopped the theory from spreading. Forensic geologist Scott Walter turned it into television, arguing the case on the cable series America Unearthed. Researcher Zena Halpern tied it to something called the Cremona Document, a supposed medieval map linking the tower to the Templars, a document most experts who've examined it now consider a modern forgery. And still, every year people walk through Toro Park convinced they're standing inside a secret chapter of Templar history. There's also a theory involving Chinese explorers, popularized by retired submarine commander Gavin Menzies, who claimed sailors under the Chinese admiral Zheng He built the tower as a lighthouse in the early 1400s. Historians have picked that claim apart piece by piece. It's now treated as well-marketed pseudo-history. And across the street, a private museum run by Jim Egan makes yet another case that Elizabethan explorers, guided by the mathematician and royal advisor John Dee, built the tower in 1583 as an astronomical observation post. Egan has spent years trying to get professional archaeologists interested. So far, none have taken the theory seriously enough to publish on it. So you have at least 5 competing origin stories: Norse, Portuguese, Templar, Chinese, and Elizabethan, each with its own believers, and each one impossible to fully kill using paperwork alone, because paperwork from 300 or 400 years ago is incomplete by nature. What the tower needed wasn't another historian with a new theory. It needed someone willing to dig. That finally happened in 1948. The city of Newport gave permission to a team from the Society for American Archaeology, led by a Harvard archaeologist named Hugh Hinken, with fieldwork carried out by a young researcher named William S. Godfrey Jr. Over 2 seasons, Godfrey's team cut a trench roughly a meter wide straight through the site, working carefully down through layer after layer of undisturbed soil. It was slow, patient, unglamorous work, the kind that doesn't make for exciting headlines, but settles arguments better than any theory can. They recovered roughly 20,000 artifacts. Not one of them predated the 17th century. At the bottom of what appeared to be the original construction trench for the tower's footings, they found a broken clay tobacco pipe and pressed into the dirt, the print of a square-heeled boot, a style that didn't exist in medieval Europe. Colonial pottery turned up wedged among the foundation stones themselves, meaning it had to have been there while the tower was still being built, not dropped centuries later by a careless visitor. Coins scattered through the site dated to 1696 and after. Godfrey, who had actually started the project doubting the windmill theory, changed his mind by the end of it. In his 1951 Harvard dissertation, pointedly titled "Digging a Tower and Laying a Ghost," he concluded the tower was exactly what Arnold's will said it was: a colonial mill, built in the 1600s, case closed. Except it wasn't closed, not even close. Because dirt and pottery only tell you what happened at ground level, they don't rule out belief. Believers in an earlier origin simply shifted their argument upward, away from the trench and toward the sky. In the 1990s, a University of Rhode Island physicist named William Penhallow spent years documenting something genuinely interesting. Certain windows in the tower appear to align with sunrise or moonrise on specific dates, including the winter solstice, when light would travel through one window and strike a particular spot inside the chamber. It's a real, observable phenomenon, and it's the kind of detail that sounds like proof of ancient, sophisticated knowledge. But alignments like that don't carry a date stamp. A colonial builder in the 1670s could design windows to catch the solstice sun just as easily as a medieval monk could. The alignment might be deliberate, it might be coincidence. Either way, it couldn't tell you who built the tower, or when. It could only tell you where the light falls. So the argument sat there, stalled, for decades, until someone found a way to date the one part of the tower nobody had thought to test directly. Not the stone, the mortar holding the stone together. Lime mortar, it turns out, slowly absorbs carbon dioxide from the air as it hardens after being mixed, which means, in theory, you can radiocarbon date the moment it was applied, the same basic method used to date bones and charcoal adapted for masonry. In 1993, a Scandinavian-American research team went after exactly that. It included the nuclear physicist Jane Heinemeyer from the University of Aarhus in Denmark and the geologist Hogne Jungner from the University of Helsinki, working with colleagues Alf Lindroos, Asa Ringbaum, and Lynn Lancaster. Jungner drilled into the mortar packed between the tower's stone columns, going in deep enough to get past any modern repointing that might have been added during later restoration work. He came away with roughly 10 drill holes and about 25 separate mortar samples, taken from different heights and depths across the structure. As a control, the team also sampled mortar from a nearby colonial house, the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, known to have been built between 1676 and 1698. Then the samples went to a lab in Aarhus for accelerator mass spectrometry dating. The results, presented in 1995 and published for a wider audience in the journal American Scientist in 2003, placed the mortar's hardening somewhere between 1635 and 1698, with 95% confidence. Crushed and sieved together, the samples pointed to a date around 1680. Heinemeyer and Jungner's most likely range, based on their full analysis, landed between 1651 and 1679. That's not a vague medieval guess. That's a tight window sitting almost exactly on top of Benedict Arnold's lifetime, and almost exactly on top of the date his will describes the mill as already standing. As the researchers themselves put it, the finding gave additional scientific support to the colonial date already suggested by the archaeological evidence. It wasn't the first time someone had made that comparison. Back in 1848, a clergyman named Reverend Dr. Jackson compared the tower's mortar to mortar from Newport buildings dating to the early 1640s, and to the mortar sealing Benedict Arnold's own tomb. He found them essentially identical, the same mix of shell lime, sand, and gravel. A modern laboratory and a 19th century minister had reached the same conclusion, a century and a half apart. That should have ended the debate permanently. It didn't. Because radiocarbon data from mortar isn't a single clean number. It's a spread of results, and different scientists, looking at the exact same raw numbers, reached different conclusions about what they meant. A Boston College chemist named André de Bethune argued that the mortar's dating was skewed young by the way lime absorbs atmospheric carbon over time, and that once you corrected for that, the tower was more likely standing somewhere between 1440 and 1480, decades before Columbus ever sailed. A researcher named Alan Watchman pushed the estimate even earlier, arguing for a date closer to 1400. Heinemeier and Jungner fired back directly, publishing a rebuttal in 2000 with a title that left no room for ambiguity. A pre-Columbian origin for the Newport Tower can still almost certainly be excluded. Even a chemist sympathetic to the older tower theories, James Guthrie, working with a group called the New England Antiquities Research Association, admitted the data didn't provide conclusive proof of real antiquity because mortar dating methods were still underdeveloped and the sample sizes were small. So here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. The direct scientific measurement points to the 1600s. The disagreement isn't really about the numbers themselves. It's about whether you trust the numbers as measured or whether you believe they need to be mathematically corrected using assumptions that are themselves disputed. That does not prove the wildest version of the tower's story, but it does explain why, more than a century and a half after Raffin first floated the Viking theory, serious people were still arguing about it in academic journals, which is exactly why, in the early 2000s, someone decided to go back into the ground one more time. In 2003, a father and son research team, Jan and Ron Barstad, running an organization called the Chronognostic Research Foundation, used ground-penetrating radar to scan the soil around the tower, looking for buried anomalies the earlier dig might have missed. The scan showed enough to convince the Newport City Council to grant permission for a new excavation, the first dig at the site in nearly 60 years. Fieldwork ran from 2006 to 2008, carried out by professional archaeologists Ray Pasquariello and Dr. Joyce Clements from the cultural resource management firm Gray & Pape based in Providence. They found nothing that predated the 17th century, no medieval artifacts, no pre-colonial deposits tied to the tower's construction. By the end of the 2007 season, the Foundation's president, Janet Barstad, shifted the group's argument back toward the sky, back to Penhallow's astronomical alignments, because the ground, once again, had refused to give them what they were hoping to find. Two separate excavations, 60 years apart, run by different teams with different goals. Both came back with the same verdict. Whatever the tower's stones might resemble, whatever its arches echo, the physical evidence buried around it belongs entirely to colonial New England. And yet the tower is still standing there today, still cracked, still argued over, still deeply loved by people who want it to be something more than a mill. In 2011, part of its upper wall actually collapsed, forcing emergency repairs. The damage exposed decades of well-meaning but flawed restoration work. 20th century crews had patched the tower using modern Portland cement, a material that traps moisture and slowly destroys old stone from the inside instead of protecting it. In September of 2018, the Newport City Council approved roughly $27,000 to bring in a structural engineering firm, Wyss, Janney, Elstner Associates, to laser scan the entire tower, map every crack in its walls, and draft a long-term conservation plan. The city's buildings and ground supervisor, Scott Wheeler, described the goal in a way that says more about this mystery than almost anything else in its 400-year history. The plan, he said, was meant to guide the city's efforts to preserve the tower in its current form, so future generations could continue to debate its origins. Read that sentence again. The official plan wasn't to solve the mystery, It was to protect the mystery well enough that people could keep arguing about it forever. City manager Joseph Nicholson, describing the same repairs, noted there were already large cracks running through the lower structure and loose stones sitting in the supporting archways. A 400-year-old question, quite literally, starting to crumble under its own weight. Crews eventually replaced the harmful cement patches with a compatible, breathable lime mortar, closer to what the original 17th century builders would have used. The Newport Historical Society, for its part, has stayed firmly planted in the colonial windmill camp, and has even floated a specific candidate for who might have actually built it under Arnold's direction, a local Newport builder named Nicholas Easton, known for constructing other circular stone structures around the colony. One member of the Historical Society, quoted years ago describing the group's confidence in the windmill theory, put the odds at 99.9%, not certainty, just a number close enough to certainty to keep the argument alive in that remaining 0.1%. And the argument really has stayed alive. A separate study commissioned in connection with the City Council in 2016 that once again pointed to that same narrow colonial window, roughly 1650 to 1677. Yet, as recently as the 2020s, at least one writer, Patrick Shackleton, was still arguing the tower was actually a 12th century baptistery built on evidence archaeologists say misreads old maps entirely. Local papers keep circling back to it too, running fresh feature investigations on the tower's origins because readers, generation after generation, keep wanting to know the same thing. Has anybody actually solved this yet? That tension between an institution that wants to protect a settled historical record and a public that wants the tower to mean something bigger is really the deepest layer of this story. Because a colonial mill is useful history. It's true, it's documented, and it fits neatly into Rhode Island's founding narrative. But it doesn't sell postcards the way a Viking tower does. It doesn't fill a private museum the way a Templar conspiracy does. Newport is a tourist city, and mystery is worth more to a tourist city than certainty. Nobody involved has to be lying for that pressure to exist. It's just there, quietly, every time a tour guide chooses which version of the story to tell. So if the Newport Tower isn't proof of pre-Columbian contact, what would proof actually look like? It's worth asking because somewhere out there, in a much colder landscape, that proof already exists. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, were searching the coastline of Newfoundland in Canada, following clues from the Old Norse sagas, when local residents led them to a set of grass-covered mounds near a fishing village called L'Anse aux Meadows. Excavations ran from 1961 to 1968, and what came out of the ground there wasn't ambiguous at all. 8 timber and turf buildings, constructed in a style that matched Norse architecture from Iceland and Greenland almost exactly. Ironworking debris, roughly 800 artifacts consistent with an 11th century Norse presence. This wasn't a resemblance argument built on arches and Romanesque lines. This was a Norse settlement sitting undisturbed under the turf for nearly 1,000 years, and it remains to this day the only confirmed pre-Columbian European settlement anywhere in the Americas outside of Greenland. UNESCO recognized it as a World Heritage Site in 1978. But the most remarkable part of that story happened decades later in a laboratory, not a trench. In 2021, a research team led by Margot Cuitems, working with colleagues from the University of Groningen and Parks Canada, published a study in the journal Nature that pinned down the exact year Norse settlers cut the timber used to build at L'Anse aux Meadows. Their method relied on something extraordinary. In the year 992, a massive solar storm slammed the Earth with cosmic radiation, leaving a distinct, measurable spike of radiocarbon buried in that year's tree ring all across the planet. By finding that spike in wood samples from Lancel Meadows and then counting the growth rings outward from it to the bark's outer edge, researchers could calculate, tree ring by tree ring, the precise year the tree was cut down. 3 separate timber samples all gave the same answer. Quetums described it simply: finding the solar storm signal 29 growth rings in from the bark allowed the team to conclude the wood had been cut in the year 1021, not around 1021, not sometime in the 11th century. The year 1021 exactly, verified independently across multiple trees. That is what real, converging pre-Columbian evidence looks like: architecture, artifacts, and a dating method so precise it can name a single year, nearly a millennium later. The Newport Tower has never produced anything remotely close to that. No Norse tools, no Norse building technique, no independent dating method converging on a pre-colonial date instead of pointing away from one. Compared to Lancel Meadows, the tower isn't just unproven. It's a different category of claim entirely. And New England has other cautionary tales worth remembering here, because not every mysterious stone tells the same kind of story. In 1898, a Minnesota farmer named Olaf Oman claimed to have found a large stone slab tangled in the roots of a tree on his property, covered in runic writing that described a Norse expedition supposedly reaching the region in 1362. It became known as the Kensington Runestone, and for over a century it's divided believers from skeptics. Modern rhinologists, including scholars like Henrik Williams, who've spent careers studying medieval Scandinavian languages, have concluded the inscription's grammar and vocabulary don't match anything a real 14th century Norse traveler would have written. Most experts today treat it as a 19th century hoax, likely created by Oman himself. There's also the Westford Knight, a faint pattern carved into a glacial boulder in Massachusetts, first described in 1873 and later reinterpreted in 1954 by a researcher named Frank Glenn as a memorial to a knight who died during Henry Sinclair's supposed 1398 voyage. Careful geological assessment found the marks are mostly natural glacial scratches, with the distinctive sword shape likely carved much later, possibly around the year 1900, by someone hoping to give the boulder a more exciting story. Those two examples matter because they show what real forgery and real wishful thinking actually look like once experts examine them closely: language that doesn't fit the period, tool marks that don't match the claimed age, evidence that collapses the moment someone applies the same rigor used at Lancel Meadows. The Newport Tower has survived nearly 2 centuries of that exact kind of scrutiny without collapsing into an obvious hoax, and without producing a single piece of hard evidence for its most exciting theories either. It sits in a strange, uncomfortable middle ground. Not a fraud, not proof, just a genuinely old, genuinely mysterious-looking colonial building that happened to be constructed by people who, whether they meant to or not, built something that looked like it belonged to an entirely different century. Maybe that's the real answer, hiding underneath 400 years of argument. Not a Viking church, not a Templar sanctuary, not a lighthouse built by the sailors of a Chinese admiral, just a 17th century governor, a working mill, and an architectural style borrowed, almost certainly, from windmills he would have known back in England, like the surviving stone tower mill at Chesterton in Warwickshire, built in the early 1630s on arches and columns that look, from certain angles, remarkably similar to the one still standing in Toro Park today. The resemblance wasn't ancient contact. It was an Englishman building what he already knew how to build, 3,000 miles from home. But knowing that doesn't kill the mystery. It just changes what the mystery actually is. The real story was never really about who physically built the tower. It was about why so many people, for so long, needed it to be someone else. A Danish scholar, looking for proof his ancestors got here first. A poet looking for a heroic ghost to write about. A psychologist convinced a lost Portuguese sailor left one final message behind. A television host building an audience out of Templar secrets. A private museum owner still trying to convince the world that an Elizabethan magician sent explorers to build an observatory on a quiet hill in Rhode Island. Every one of those theories says less about the 17th century than it does about the people doing the theorizing, reaching backward across centuries for a story bigger than the one the evidence actually supports. The tower doesn't care which version people choose to believe. It just keeps standing there, roofless, cracked, patched with lime mortar chemists can still date down to a range of decades, waiting for whoever visits next. The park sign near its base doesn't try to settle the argument either. It simply says the tower's past is clouded with historical uncertainty and leaves it at that, an official admission carved in weatherproof metal that the city itself isn't entirely sure how much of the mystery it's willing to let go of. Because the truth is, Newport doesn't actually want this solved, not completely. A settled mystery brings fewer visitors than an open one, so the city keeps funding conservation studies instead of final verdicts, keeps repairing the cracks instead of closing the case, keeps letting the tower's arches frame the sky, the exact same way they have for 3.5 centuries. Stand under it at sunset, when the light drops low and slides straight through one of those old windows, the same way it has every winter solstice for as long as anyone has been watching, and you'll understand why. It doesn't look like the ruin of a corn mill. It looks like it's still waiting for someone to finally prove it wrong.